sit down and then we can get started. Well, good evening. I'm Tim Christ. I'm one of the trustees of the Newark History Society, and I just wanted to welcome you to our program tonight. We've had a pretty full series of programs so far in 2009. We started in January with co-sponsoring a program at the Newark Public Library about Kenny Hospital, Newark's Black Hospital. And then in March, we had a first-rate program on the Great Depression in Newark, followed in April with a lively panel discussion on community development organizations in Newark, from the Great Society to the Great Recession, I think we called it. Tonight we get to do something that those of us who started the Newark History Society 7 or 8 years ago have wanted to do from the very beginning, and that is to gather folks who are working on Newark, either as part of their doctoral research or as part of recent dissertations. And I'm just thrilled that so many of you came out tonight for this sort of program, because showcasing recent research, giving these scholars a chance to talk about it, having the chance to ask them questions is something that we really want to do in the Newark History Society, to encourage even more research into Newark's singular history. Warren has asked me to welcome one of our members in particular, just to welcome Ken Jackson tonight, the Dean of American Urban History, if we can call him that, at Columbia University, and a support of our efforts from the very beginning, but he's made it to a program, so we're real pleased with that. If you're not on our mailing list, either U.S. postal mail or email, please slip me a business card or an address, or Warren Grover or Dan Flaherty or Gail Malmgren or Tom McCabe. We're the ones who and Becky would also be glad, Becky Doggett would also be glad to take names and addresses. We're the ones who kind of get together every now and again and figure out what are we going to do next, and we're going to have to do that after this meeting as well. I'm going to ask Linda Epps, the director of the New Jersey Historical Society, to bring greetings, and then Warren Grover is going to bring news about our Newark Archives project, and then we'll launch into our program. Linda?
Good evening to all of you. Welcome once again, for you repeat visitors, to the New Jersey Historical Society, and welcome once again to the Newark History Society. We are just been enriched by so many of your programs, and I'm glad that you decided to keep having them here, because we love the collaboration. Someone this evening welcomed another guest by saying, "Oh well, another Newark nerd." And I laughed just like you did. And I said, I guess that's exactly what we are. We're Newark nerds. We love this city, and the problem is that so many people still cannot understand why we love this city, why we have a passion for this place. But we do. And I think as long as we have this core group of people whose every fiber is caught up into what happens to Newark, that there is hope. And I think we're pretty good now, but we'll even be better in the future. So I welcome you again this evening. Please continue. We hope we continue to grow in our nerdiness, and that we can look forward to many programs like this in the future.
Quickly, the Newark Archives project was begun about 2 years ago. People like myself who write on Newark have found for the last number of years that to find sources on Newark is difficult. You have to go to each institution. You have to ask the curator. Very often the curators, the right ones aren't there and you can't find the right sources. So it's been very difficult. So we decided a few years ago, the Newark History Society, to set up a website that anybody in the country, anybody in the world would be able to find all the archives that we could list on Newark, so that it would enable them to do their research in a much more easy fashion. We are very lucky. We partnered with Newark Rutgers, and over the last year we have a letter of understanding with them, and we've begun to do the important work with the DP department at Rutgers, with their archival department, and we are now at the stage. They have a archival collection called WAND, Women American Artists of the United States, and that is going to be our basis. It's going to be very similar to the type of work we're going to do. We're going to dovetail onto their site, and the Newark Archive project is well on its way. So I would be happy to say that within 3 or 4 years there will be an interactive archival database that anybody will be able to find sources on Newark history. Thank you. How could I do this? Tom McCabe is the organizer of tonight's event. Tom, as you know, is a Rutgers professor. He teaches the course on Newark history. He is also, his dissertation was on St. Benedict's, and he's very close to having it published. Tom?
I'm a Newark nerd, and I'm so nerdy that I bought my 2 copies of Ken Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier. It's kind of like the kid at the ballpark and his autographed book, so I got wind that he might be here, so maybe I can get those signed later. Perhaps my favorite quote on doing history comes from the famed British historian Simon Schama. He once said, "History needs to declare itself unapologetically for what it is, the study of the past in all its splendid messiness." A dear friend of the Newark History Society, Dr. Clement Price, puts it another way: historians complicate the narrative. Tonight we have 3 young historians who have all researched the Renaissance city. I'd like to suggest that they're the new next generation of Newark historians. Of course, we're standing on the shoulders of some people in this room, both chroniclers and actors in Newark's history. And I'm sure that they'll all agree during their comments that this process for them has been like Simon Schama's view of history. It's been parts messy and parts splendid. Research always is. And of course, they complicate our view of this great city. If you allow me to mix some metaphors, researching the Renaissance city has been about looking for the tree amidst the forest, panning for the golden nugget amid useless rock and soil, finding the pearl along the ocean floor. Then it's about making sense of it all and sharing it with an audience like this. Our format tonight will have these 3 young scholars in succession. Once they're finished, all 3 are finished, we encourage you to pepper them with questions and comments. Our first speaker tonight, we're going in alphabetical order, is John Gutierrez, City University Graduate Center, and his talk will be between a Roth and a Baraka, researching and writing the Latino history of Newark. A native Newarker, John holds a Master's in Philosophy and History from CUNY and was the founding administrative director of their Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. He will talk about his current project. We'd like to welcome John.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you all. As a native Newarker, I'm delighted to see you all here. This is one of those things you sort of, I guess I'm a Newark nerd too, so I just whatever. A few months ago when Tom approached me about this panel, I was a bit hesitant to agree to participate. Not because I wasn't flattered, but because, to be quite honest, I'm new to the business of researching and writing about the history of Newark. But the more I thought about it, the less hesitant I was to accept the invitation. And in part, this was because I believe and continue to believe that Newark is an important city in the telling of modern U.S. Latino history, a field of study in which I feel fairly comfortable. The successive waves of Latinos settling in the city, first the Puerto Ricans, then the Cubans and Dominicans, and more recently the Ecuadorians and Peruvians, have been key elements of the city's development since the 1950s, and if census figures are to be believed, they, more than any other group, will be charged with navigating the city's future. But what made me feel more comfortable still about talking to you all this evening was when I came to the realization that in many respects the Latino history of late 20th century Newark is, part of my ego, but is about me. My parents arrived in Newark in October of 1967. They didn't notice what was going on. It's amazing what happens when you don't speak English. They did not get the papers. I've actually asked them about this, and they're like, we just didn't see it. They were exiles from Cuba, and they had come to Newark looking, as did many of their friends and family members, for a new beginning away from the rhetoric of the new man and the exhortations of socialism or death. In Newark, believe it or not, they found a growing colonia of Cuban exiles, many of whom had settled in the Ironbound and in the North Ward. We were in the latter group. Although their numbers were never large, in 1970 there were about 10,000 Cubans living in the city proper. For me, as a kid growing up in the North Ward, that was the world that I knew. My barber was Cuban, our butcher, our baker. You get the hint, yeah. All of the people that my father did business with as a shoe salesman here on Broad Street, not too far, at a place called La Isla Shoes, were almost all Cubans. Our social circle was built around a Cuban-owned dance studio on Mount Prospect Avenue in the North Ward. Every October we celebrated a traditional Cuban comparsa at a local hotel, and at least once over at Newark Symphony Hall we had made it. We had enough people to fill Symphony Hall. Early September, we, my mother, my sister, my grandparents, and I would join the procession for the Feast of Our Lady of Charity, who was the patroness of Cuba. That left Our Lady of Good Counsel Church on Summer Avenue, where I went to school for grammar school. And we would wind our way through the streets of the North Ward with the Virgin at the lead. And there were probably thousands of worshipers there. Actually, there were probably hundreds of worshipers there, but in my mind's eye, I see thousands. My sister and I joked, and my sister is a social worker in the Newark public school system, but she joked that while we were born in Newark, we had been raised in Cuba. As I became older, though, the nexus between Cuba and Newark became of great interest to me as a researcher. And what I found was, to be honest with you, a mixed bag. Newark was, from the historiographical standpoint at least, an understudied subject, it seemed to me. There were notable exceptions, of course. John Cunningham's survey of Newark, Clem Price's study of the African American community at the first half of the 20th century, Paul Stellhorn's study of Newark politics in the 1930s, Robert Curtin's work on the early Gibson years. These all come to mind. But for the neophyte looking for a modern history survey of the city, there was and remains, to my mind, a giant void. As far as Latinos were concerned, the situation was more desperate still. Putting aside the situation of the city's Cuban community, which has always lived in the shadow of the much larger Cuban communities of Hudson and Union counties, what was astonishing to me was how little had been done to understand the presence of tens of thousands of Puerto Rican migrants who began arriving in the city in the 1950s. Nowhere had there been an analysis of the Puerto Rican migration to Newark to rival the groundbreaking work of New York's admittedly larger Puerto Rican population by Virginia Sanchez Coro in her now groundbreaking book, From Colonia to Community. The Puerto Ricans, who I knew were there, I saw them, I grew up with them, seem to have disappeared within the narrative of the city. Nowhere, perhaps, was the historical silence greater than when we looked at the largely forgotten events of the late summer 1974. And here I just want to give a brief recap of the problem really that brought me to study Newark much more closely, which were what we call the Puerto Rican riots of 1974. Just very briefly, on September 1st, 1974, nearly 10,000 people, mainly Puerto Ricans, gathered at the southern end of Newark's Branchford Park for a Labor Day picnic. Despite the large crowd gathered at the park and the humid conditions that summer day, the festival, which had been organized by the Puerto Rican community-based organization Focus, which is not too far away from here, went along without incident just until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was then, according to witnesses, that the Essex County Park police officers, many of whom were riding on horseback, began to argue with a group of Puerto Rican festival goers. The police claimed that they had tried to put an end to an illegal public game of dice. The Puerto Ricans argued that the police had continually harassed vendors hawking at the picnic. Whatever the truth, a violent confrontation erupts between the police and the park goers that included rock and bottle throwing, the burning of Newark police cars, and the arrest of several local residents. 3 Puerto Ricans were shot and 2 would die. After meeting with local elected officials from the city's North Ward, Newark's only recently elected mayor, Ken Gibson, met with some of the city's Puerto Rican leaders to assess the situation at the park. He decided to invite the angry crowd to join him at City Hall to visit, to discuss both the incidents and their broader concerns about living in the city. Alternately walking and riding in a car, Gibson led a group of approximately 1,000 Puerto Ricans through the city's North Ward, into downtown Newark, and ultimately to the steps of City Hall. The first Puerto Ricans to meet with the mayor that afternoon and evening were representatives of Focus and other moderate Puerto Rican groups. They formed what would be known as the Hispanic Emergency Council. The group had 3 basic demands: immediate release of Puerto Ricans arrested at the park and being held at the North Ward Precinct House, preventing the police from intervening in Puerto Rican social events in the future, and establishing a committee to investigate the day's tragic events. The pressure on Mayor Gibson to act quickly was intensified by the presence of nearly 1,000 Puerto Ricans outside of City Hall. When the Puerto Rican representatives who met with the mayor emerged from their meeting saying that Gibson had agreed to release the arrested and meet with the group again the following day, the crowd, which by this time had encircled members of the Newark Police Department, never a good idea, began to disperse. Tensions remained high in the city, obviously, but it seemed as if that flash of violence in the park that had flared earlier in the afternoon had passed. The following day, however, 1 hour before the meeting between the mayor and the Hispanic Emergency Council was to have begun, a group calling itself the People's Committee Against Repression and Police Brutality called on the mayor at City Hall. The group, a much more radical group, obviously, which included members of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, the Young Lords, Amiri Baraka, and others, had demands of their own for Gibson. The demands were much more significant, I think, than the demands of the much more moderate Puerto Rican group. They included the dismissal of the police director, the establishment of a civilian complaint review board, and that Newark's police tactical and mounted units be disbanded, and that there would be an end, quote, an end to police brutality against the Puerto Rican community, end quote. When Gibson demurred, not surprisingly, the crowd that had accompanied the more militant faction of Puerto Ricans to City Hall began to hurl rocks and bottles. Confronted by an angry crowd and unable, as he had been 24 hours earlier, to calm tensions, Gibson authorized the police to disperse the crowd. And for the next few days, the city of Newark, which only a few years earlier had experienced the worst rioting in its 400-year history, was again waging a war against itself. Demonstrators throughout many of Newark's Puerto Rican neighborhoods burned cars, looted stores, set fires to buildings including the convent at St. Lucy's Church on Columbus and 7th Avenues. And the Newark police, for their part, unleashed a torrent of violence that included the alleged beating of a pregnant woman and dozens of arrests. 7 years after the riots had torn apart much of the city's central ward, looting and violence threatened to destroy other areas of the city. And by the week's end, the violence had subsided, but it was clear that there were some significant challenges facing the Gibson administration, not the least of which was the profound discontent of many of Newark's Puerto Ricans. Now, as a historian, the events of 1974 seem to me to be an important chapter in the history of the city, and if nothing else, a valuable epilogue to the events of 1967. Yet even as late as a couple of years ago, Kevin Mumford's otherwise excellent monograph on race, rights, and riot in Newark treated the Puerto Rican riots of 1974 as an afterthought. It's virtually unmentioned in the book. This led me to the historian's sort of central question, which is why? Why would we arrive at a point where this seemingly important event in the history of Newark was ignored? And here, I'll just tell you my sort of ideas about why I think this happens. The first is that I think that, and I'm delighted to hear the Newark Archive project is up and running and thriving. The first is the lack of data. Any historian who arrives interested in working in the Latino community or on the history of the Latino community in Newark encounters the same obstacle that historians of other groups or other themes finds as well, which is that it is difficult to get good information about what happened here in the city. That problem has been ameliorated in some respect by the existence of the Hispanic Information Project at the Newark Public Library. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this initiative, but in a small room in the library, it doesn't, and those of you who have done research at the National Archives in College Park or the Library of Congress, you have it good, because this is a very, very small room, but very rich in material on the Hispanic communities, not just of Newark, but of New Jersey in general. And it's there, really thanks to the work of Professor Olga Jimenez de Wagenheim, that we had the beginnings of a good archival collection on the Latino communities of Newark. It will never be like the Center for Puerto Rican Studies archive at Hunter. We recognize that. But it is certainly a positive first step for historians who are interested in the history of Latinos in the city. The second, and I think much more problematic issue, is that in many respects the history of Newark, and here, here's where I sort of got my title. The city of Newark in many respects is caught between two narratives, and those narratives are the narrative of white Eastern European immigrants arriving in Newark at the end of the 19th century and remaining here through the first half of the 20th century, and then the rise of the African American community from the 1920s forward. There seems to be no space, historiographically speaking, for Latino history in the city. We're caught in many respects, and I was talking to Tom about this earlier today. We are caught in many respects between the iconic figures of Philip Roth and Amiri Baraka. We have nothing that we can offer here along the lines of those two iconic figures. It's not that the history isn't important, but it's just difficult to get public attention when you don't have these two giants that you can offer to the public at large. Thirdly, and I think this is an issue that confronts those of us who are interested in Latino studies generally speaking, is that for historians of the U.S. Latino experience, our focus inevitably is on those cities which are almost iconically Latino. New York, Miami, Los Angeles, California actually as a whole, Texas as a whole. Those are the places where you are seeing the most dynamic scholarship on the history of the Latino community in the United States. And again, a part of it has to do with the fact that for 30 years we've been writing about the Mexican American community in the Southwest and in Texas. There is a base of scholarship there upon which to be built. Unlike the Puerto Rican community, for example, where we only have scattershot material for places like New York, Newark, Hartford, etc. So why do this? Why study this thing that's very hard to analyze because there's no data and no one's writing about it? Because it matters. Because the reality is that there is a rich tradition here in Newark of Latino life. And it is a tradition played out both in tandem with and in opposition to the narratives that we see from the white ethnic community in places like Weequahic to the African American experience in the Central Ward. Walk through the streets of the North Ward and you will see how the history of the Latino history of the city is very much alive. And I think that merits our attention as much as anything else. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
belong to Mark Krasovic. His topic is State Meet the Ghetto, Researching the Great Society in Newark. Mark is currently the Geraldine R. Dodge Postdoc Fellow at the Rutgers Institute of Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. His 2008 dissertation from Yale, The Struggle for Newark, Plotting Urban Crisis in the Great Society, was a finalist for the American Studies Association Ralph Henry Gabriel Dissertation Prize. So welcome to Mark.
Thanks, Tom. And I too should start by saying that I'm thrilled to hear about this Newark Archives project. Although my story, what I want to talk about tonight, is different than John's in that I'm not going to talk about sort of a lack of sources, but actually what I consider to be a treasure trove of sources and how that treasure trove came about. But about the Archives project, I just got back from Madison, Wisconsin, which is where my wife is from, and mostly as a way to avoid the in-laws, I decided to go to the Wisconsin Historical Society's website and do some searches for Newark and people in Newark, and was surprised to find in the middle of Madison, Wisconsin, is a ton of stuff on Newark, some really important stuff that I don't think anybody's really looked at before. At least I hope, because now I have. So it'd be great to have all that information sort of pulled together, because this stuff shows up in unexpected places. My talk is also different from John's in that I am in some ways the consummate Newark outsider. Although I think my dad actually sold shoes in Newark.
This could be problematic.
Maybe some of you guys, I'm not their competitors or what. But
You have to just move the mic up.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Well, you guys are probably, some people here might know better than me if there's what was the department store? Two Guys?
Yes.
And there was one in Newark, and do they have a shoe department? I think that's...
Earlier than that was Bamberger.
Sure. I think he worked for Two Guys in like Woodbridge or somewhere, and then I think he also spent time up at the Newark store selling shoes. But anyway, I grew up in Piscataway, which I'm sure some of you know.
Or Chase.
What's that?
Just like the Christies or Chase people were two guys.
I'll have to double check. Sorry, a treasure trove of sources. I grew up in Piscataway, and so had these very tenuous family connections to Newark. My dad sort of worked here sometimes doing something. My uncle had gone to Rutgers Newark and always talked about McGovern's with that sort of glow. His nose sort of glowed. But when I told my uncle, for example, that I was going to write this dissertation on Newark, his first question was, well, are you going to have to go there? and so I would just start by making the argument that sort of Newark outsiders, and me, this white kid who grew up in the suburbs, that it's not that we don't know anything about Newark, it's just that a lot of what we know is probably wrong, but Newark does have this fixed place in our sort of cultural imaginary. And just that notion sort of fascinated me when I got to graduate school. And so I should start by saying that the original plans for this dissertation, and what will hopefully in the next couple of years be a book, came about after reading Thomas Segru's book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis on Detroit, which some of you may know. And it was a wonderful book in all sorts of ways. But it was very new for me, this notion that this urban crisis had been formed, or that it was a sociological phenomenon defined, at least in that book, primarily by racial isolation, in other words, segregation, and economic, especially job discrimination. Right? These are the things that cultural imaginary doesn't include in the story, right? You don't know the details of how places got that way. You just think, in Newark's case, that it's horrible. So Segru tells this story beginning with World War II and ends sort of roughly in the early 1960s. Although in the conclusion to the book, he does deal a little bit with the Detroit riots of 1967, just a week or so after Newark's. And images of that violence in Detroit adorn the cover of at least 2 editions of the book, the only 2 editions that I know of. So that those events sort of loom large there, although he doesn't deal with them all that much. So in any case, the original idea was to write a sequel to Segru. So if he wrote about the origins of the urban crisis, what was its aftermath? So what happened after those riots in Detroit or, say, in Newark? Those riots formed such a convenient narrative marker. All these long social processes that dominated post-war American life, these various migrations, shifts in the nation's macroeconomy, these broad political developments, they all seem to lead up to this one moment of crisis. Again, pictured on the cover of Segru's book. So I headed off to the New Jersey State Archives and to the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, where I knew that they had the records of the Governor's Select Commission on Civil Disorders, those are the ones down in Trenton, and the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, otherwise known as the Kerner Commission, which is in the LBJ Library. And both of these, some of you probably know this, are a real treasure trove of information, not just about those 5 days in July of 1967, but more broadly about Newark in the 1960s. But what I couldn't help but notice, what struck me more than anything else, was that while reading through the transcripts of the Commission's hearings, was that the urban crisis meant many different things to many different people. In other words, the meaning of the urban crisis wasn't as self-evident as it appears on the first page of Thomas Segru's book, where he lays out his definition. So you have, for example, in the transcripts of these hearings, Paul Ylvisaker, who was the first director of the State Department of Community Affairs, and he was formerly of the Ford Foundation, whose basic principles, I think, can be described as liberal and technocratic. The broad social dynamics that have produced these race riots, as surely as subterranean pressures produce volcanic eruptions, could be addressed only by forceful action at high levels of government, federal government. He said things like, quote, "I would rather talk as a microbiologist. When the soil changes to an acid, when its pH goes in a certain direction, the whole culture of the soil changes, and you get far more organisms than you did have before." He's giving testimony on civil disorders. You get no sense of this. What I am driving at is the soil of our central cities is growing acid. I don't really know what that means. But he also spoke about studying the problem through microscopes, through telescopes, and as one would a forest fire. So this very social, scientific, and technocratic vision of the urban crisis. Then you would have someone like Police Director Dominic Spina, who treated the phenomenon not primarily as an issue for high government action, but as a law enforcement matter. He spoke of the need to keep tabs on alleged radical conspirators and to act swiftly and forcefully to quell any violence once it had broken out. But you also had someone like Esther Williams, who was the chairwoman of the 4th Precinct Council, vice chair of the Hayes Homes Tenant League, and an active participant in Newark's anti-poverty program. She was not, of course, ignorant of the problems in the Central Ward where she lived, and she spoke of inadequate schools, dilapidated housing, unemployment, all those things that Ylvisaker and his sort of technocratic colleagues also talked about. But for her, the overriding issue is one of power. Unilateral action on the part of the federal government or on the part of law enforcement wouldn't solve the problem. In fact, she believed that's what had caused it. Political alienation was the core problem in her mind, and the establishment of true political equality, what she had worked for in all those civic duties that I just mentioned, was the only true answer to the urban crisis. So given this, these voices that were new to me, these people who didn't configure the urban crisis in the same way that Thomas Segru, who was my launching point for this whole work, given this, I decided to sort of switch gears a bit. And my project no longer was this sort of social scientific one, in which I would track those broad economic and social developments past the riots, but more to a humanities-based one, or a cultural history, in which what I would do instead was track different versions of the urban crisis, different people's readings of what that meant, different interpretations, different definitions, and to embed them in a historical context and study the ways that these readings of urban crisis were generated and mobilized for certain political ends. Now, although no one has ever really treated the urban crisis as a cultural phenomenon, rather than, say, a socioeconomic phenomenon, that it meant different things to different people probably isn't really all that surprising. For me, I think it's one of those things that I never really thought of, but then once you discover this, oh yeah, of course. So I don't want to talk so much tonight about those differing versions, but more about the circumstances that made those different versions available to me as the historian. So if you just go to the reports of the riot commissions, I think you would miss the richness of the voices captured in the testimony that the commissions gathered. Though, to be fair, I think the Governor's Commission captures a bit more of it than, say, the Kerner Commission does in its report. By and large, both of these liberal riot commissions produced versions of the crisis that resembled Ildesacker's reading much more than it did either Spina's or Ms. Williams' version of events. And yet, without those commissions, I might not have gained much of an appreciation for those numerous voices. I might have gotten the gist of Spina's way of thinking from other sources, but I probably would have never even heard of Esther Williams. I don't think I've encountered her name anywhere else but in that testimony she gave to the Riot Commission. So what really strikes me now about my experience in those archives is not so much the differing voices themselves, but the fact that these government commissions played such a crucial role in publicizing them, at the same time that they sought to manage, or perhaps in some cases hide or ignore them. In other words, the commissions issued their very public reports, which received lots of news coverage, a lot of public responses to them. And in those reports, they by and large left out these alternative voices, but they simultaneously made those voices available. They made them public, and that's what I mean by publicize, at least to someone willing to spend a couple of weeks in these archives reading through these thousands of pages of testimony, which I had nothing better to do, being a Newark nerd. This commission process of at once generating, managing, sort of burying, at least in the archives, but nonetheless salvaging and publicizing, again via the archives, is this process sort of fascinates me as a cultural historian. And this process goes back at least, I'm sure we could trace this back quite a ways in all sorts of commissions, but for me, on this particular topic, it goes back at least to what I consider to be the dawn of the very notion of urban crisis, which I would argue can be traced back to the hearings held in August 1966 by a Senate subcommittee on government reorganization led by Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut. And this was in response to the violence that had broken out the month before in Cleveland's Huff neighborhood. So I would argue that it was right around then, when Huff's outbreak really made it look like these riots would be a regular, recurring feature of the summer months. And Ribicoff called for hearings on them, rather he called for hearings on what he explicitly termed the urban crisis, that the urban crisis had arrived as an idea, as a phrase, as a cultural marker. And I spent some time doing these researches of online data searches in online databases, newspapers, magazines, scholarly journals for that phrase urban crisis. And what I found is that before, say, 66 or 67, when you do see that phrase, and it's very rare, what it generally signifies is fears of massive urbanization, of the thousands upon thousands of millions of people who are moving to the cities, not just in the United States, but across the world. That the cities were getting too clogged. That was what the crisis meant, say, before 66, 67. But with Huff and Ribicoff, the meanings of urban crisis came to center around black violence and the events that led up to, or allegedly led up to, this violence. It was the rending of the urban fabric, not the bursting of its seams, that came to signify the crisis. So if you read through the newspaper reports of these Ribicoff hearings, you'll find virtually the same pattern that you see in the commission testimony. You see this sort of liberal take, in this case Ribicoff himself, or his colleague Bobby Kennedy, or Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, who testified before them. You see a law and order take. The Cleveland Mayor Ralph Locher presented, sort of his version of Spina's testimony, as you could say. And you found a power, perhaps a black power version, in this case represented by a group called the East Central Citizens Organization from Columbus, Ohio, who argued that the only proper way to attack these conditions was through, quote, neighborhood self-government, or Martin Luther King himself, who, as far as I know, this was the only time he testified before Congress, He testified that though he worried that the unsophisticated, as he put it, might translate it as racial separatism and get whitey, he had no problem with black power if it meant racial pride in the amassing of economic and political power. But like in the case of the commissions, not all these voices made it into Ribikoff's final report. Once again, publicizing, especially in the form of these newspaper reports of the testimony, and managing, taking out only the desired bits from the testimony to include in these hearings' final report, is the process here. So sort of publicizing and managing. So back to the Governor's Commission for another example. Now, if you go to the State Archives in Trenton, if you look at Exhibit C50 in the Commission's records, you'll find a flyer with a picture of Amiri Baraka on it, printed below the words, "Political prisoner." Black people, it warns, we sat back and permitted these devils to kill and murder Brother Malcolm X. We cannot allow the extermination of another black leader. This flyer is attached to a police report written by a black police detective to his superior in the Newark Police Department Intelligence Unit. The police report tells us that someone called police headquarters from the offices of the United Community Corporation, which was Newark's main anti-poverty agency, its community action agency. So somebody had called from UCC headquarters to report that another anti-poverty worker was running off what he called hate literature in the offices. So the detective and his partner were dispatched. They confiscated the flyer. They ordered that any copies be destroyed. And they wrote up their report, stapled a copy of the flyer to it, and submitted it to their superiors. It made its way up the chain of command to Police Director Spina, who brought it with him when he went to testify before the Governor's Commission as but one piece of evidence of radical activity in Newark, the type of activity that leads to violence. And it was led by Bob Kirk. He actually pretty much said that. He explained that the flyer had been run off by a guy named Charles McCrae, who had been pulled over and arrested on weapons charges along with two friends of his, one of them Baraka, in the early morning hours of the riot's third day. This was early Friday morning. So, to me, this is incredibly rich ground for the historian, and perhaps especially the cultural historian. You can offer your reading of the flyer itself. That exists in the archives. But it's attached to the detective's report, which supplies both the reading of the anonymous caller, the one who called it hate literature, and the reading of the detective himself, who had warned workers at the UCC that this flyer could prove inflammatory. And this was all submitted by Police Director Spina, who deemed it evidence of conspiracy to create riot-prone conditions, and made available to the historian in the records of the Commission at the State Archives, where you read it in the context of the Commission's final report, as well as the thousands of other pages of testimony and evidence that the Commission gathered. There's a lot one can do with that. All spun off of one piece of street literature that might have been lost for all time, ephemerality being perhaps the essential nature of this type of literature, this type of material, if it hadn't been for this sort of liberal riot commission. So you get the drift here. But I would argue that such possibilities for researching Newark, and I think in some ways perhaps uniquely Newark, are peculiar to the era of the Great Society. Historians have often identified state expansion as one hallmark of these years, and advisory boards and commissions were a significant element in that expansion. Two students of commissions in general, particularly riot commissions, dubbed President Johnson the Great Commissioner for having established an average of 4 commissions per year during his 5 years in office. And using a somewhat broader categorization, they reported that 132 boards and commissions were established between 1965 and the summer of 1968 to advise the President, Congress, and executive agencies. So this is just at the federal level. This number of commissions and study groups is being formed by different branches of the federal government. And I think that this is striking. That they spend so much time investigating and studying various phenomena, but I think a lot of this went toward the study of inner cities, black life in inner cities, and this violence. So it suggests to me what I think is crucial to know about the Great Society, that it was expanding into areas in which government had very little direct experience. There seems to have been a great felt need to study before one could act or perhaps legislate. This, of course, would be decried by someone like George Wallace later in the decade, as sort of eggheadism, and then perhaps missed greatly during the era of heck of a job brownie. But I haven't found any numbers for commissions since then. This is the only sort of study that I know of commissions that provide statistics. So I don't know if this is part of a larger historical trend or if this is a trend peculiar to the 60s, but it certainly, according to this one study, sort of reached some apex during the 60s. What happened after that, I'm not sure. And with all these investigations and hearings going on, and in the case of the urban crisis or urban rioting, the possibilities are numerous and would have to include not only the Governor's Commission, the Kerner Commission, the Ribicoff hearings, but also the New Jersey State Patrolmen's Benevolent Association's report, the McCone Commission, which studied the Watts riot in 1965, and the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which launched hearings organized by Senator John McClellan of Arkansas, which resulted in the multi-volume set Riots, Criminal, and Civil Disorders. And that title itself to me suggests some of the complications awaiting the reader of this testimony. So you take all this in and the mind sort of spins at the possibilities for the interested researcher who's looking for evidence as rich as that one piece I just described, that political prisoner flyer. But the story of the flyer doesn't even end there. Of the almost 2,000 employees of the UCC, the anti-poverty agency, and the almost 3,500 full-time participants in its activities, Charles McCrae had been the only one arrested during the riots in July. The day before he headed into UCC headquarters to cut a stencil for the flyer, he, Baraka, and a third friend had been convicted on firearms charges. If you don't know the story, the cops, they pulled over their green Volkswagen van. They said that they found, I believe it was 2 revolvers in there. So the UCC's record of community activity, and indeed perhaps the record of the war on poverty as a whole, had suffered greatly from the relatively minor blemish of McCrae's arrest. The legislation that created the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is the federal agency that ran the war on poverty, and its community action program, had mandated the participation of the poor in all local community action agencies. This was the famous or infamous for some maximum feasible participation clause of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. So to make this sort of complicated story short, this inclusion of so many people who had been heretofore largely excluded from many of the key decisions that shape their own lives, decisions made by the cops, by City Hall, by their local grocer, the welfare board, the school board, their employer, etc. This clause produced a lot of friction, both locally and nationally. And McCrae's arrest is only one incident of this. But his participation in the war on poverty took his arrest and raised it to the level of a federal issue, right? And it put all this material into the archives. In its 1966 amendments to the Economic Opportunity Act, Congress had expressly forbidden any funds be used to provide payment, assistance, or services in any form to any individual convicted of inciting, promoting, or carrying on a riot, or any group activity resulting in material damage to property or injury to persons. So for the OEO itself, the riots and the alleged involvement of its employees, nationally 16 of more than 30,000 war on poverty employees had been arrested in all the nationwide instances of civil disturbances. This threatened the legitimacy of its entire operation. Were its programs, by quickening the determination of the poor to escape their dire straits, actually encouraging a violent expression of that desire, as some officials had charged? Worse yet, had UCC employees directly fomented the violence, as many city and federal officials had come to believe? Whatever the case, the situation demanded swift action from the highest levels of the war on poverty. And so what we have is another flurry of historical evidence available to us. We can learn more and more things about Newark. As public officials accused poverty workers of fomenting violence, as OEO officials warned local poverty warriors of the dangers to the UCC and to the entire war on poverty, and as local poverty warriors in Newark responded to the accusations, generated this massive amounts of paper. Much of this stuff is in the National Archives. And soon after McCrae's arrest, federal war on poverty officials warned local community action agencies of the price of failing to take punitive action against anybody who had been implicated in the riots, And that telex is in the files of the ODO's Office of Public Affairs in the National Archives. The minutes of the meeting of the UCC Board of Trustees, at which the board ruled that they would abide by the outcome of any court decision and fire McCrae if need be, but also that they had doubted that he was involved in any illegal activity. The minutes of that meeting are in the files from the office of the OEO's Director of the Community Action Program. McCrae's eventual conviction on November 6, 1967, finally forced the UCC's hand, and they suspended him the following day, which is when he nonetheless showed up at headquarters and cut the stencil and created this flyer and set this whole thing off. So after the police detectives had come and gone, the executive director of the UCC, a guy by the name of Sylvester Odom at that time, immediately began his own investigation, a narrative and the findings of which he eventually submitted to the Office of Economic Opportunity, and which is also available in the files of their Director of Community Action. Among other things, Odom wrote that McCrae had returned to UCC headquarters later that day to explain himself, and that he, meaning Odom, didn't see anything criminal in his actions or in the content of the flyer, certainly nothing akin to distributing hate literature or potentially fomenting riots. In fact, Odom suggested that the UCC worker who had called the cops should be investigated. But with his investigation concluded, Odom then sought an audience with the police director about the matter, Dominic Spina. And then it was a few days after that that Spina showed up at the governor's commission to give his testimony and gave them Exhibit C50, which is the flyer with the police reports and all that stuff. And he presented it to the commission as a key piece of evidence in a string of incidents that, quote, prove indisputably, in my opinion, that the allegations that I made and have been making for the past 2 years relative to racist literature, inciting and agitating literature by the UCC is correct. But note, when he submitted this as Exhibit C50 to the commission, he did not include Odom's report or any sense of Odom's report, even though Odom had come to him to seek an audience. Again, we see the police director managing the evidence in this way. A month and a half later, while being deposed by investigators from the Kerner Commission, Spina claimed that such literature had been, quote, paid for by federal monies to incite people along racial lines. So in addition to Great Society-era liberal investigative commissions generating impressive quantities of historical evidence, we also have the War on Poverty itself, and more specifically, I think, its Community Action Program, participating in this process of at once attempting to manage events in Newark and put forth a particular interpretation of them at the time, but unwittingly, perhaps, making available for the historian a range of other evidence and interpretive possibilities. So in the end, I take this process, as I said, as sort of a hallmark of the Great Society years. As the state apparatus expanded outward toward, in the case of what I've been researching, the black inner city, it generated not only its own conclusions, but also publicized important parts of the lives of local black activists and their alternative versions and experiences of the urban crisis. This happened because such people came to testify before government riot commissions, because these people had direct access to federal officials via the Community Action Program, which would bypass City Hall and work directly with the grassroots community groups. And most crucially, I think, because the Community Action Program, as policy, constructed space in which new forms of politics and new cultural readings of the urban crisis were helped to emerge. Who else besides the Governor's Commission had asked Esther Williams what she thought about the rioting? And who else provided a stencil cutter and mimeograph machine for Charles McCrae? But most importantly, from my vantage point, who else might have done these things and was required to put their records into a public repository?
Thank you, Mark. Mark is a little under the weather tonight, so we appreciate him soldiering on. Julia Rabig will discuss who speaks for the city, insiders and outsiders in Newark's history. Julia earned her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania with her dissertation called The Fixers, Evolution, Development, and Civil Society in Newark, New Jersey, 1960 to 1996. This fall, she will be a visiting lecturer at Boston University. Julia.
Thank you. Okay, is that all right? Well, thank you so much for inviting me. A lot of my ideas about Newark developed in during events that were held here, and in some of the research I did upstairs when I first got started with my dissertation. And I see some of the people in the room tonight that I interviewed over the last 5 years. Gosh, took a while, which should be a testament to how much there is, evidence there is of Newark's past when you start digging. So for me, the history of Newark has been a sort of process of discovering who has spoken for the city and recovering those voices. And as I study the recent past in Newark from the 1950s onward, and my dissertation focuses really on the 60s to the early 90s. One theme in my work has been the tension between insiders and outsiders in Newark. And by this I mean those people who have roots in the city, been in the city for generations, and those who are newcomers to the city. But I also see this distinction made between people, activists, for example, who've been engaged in the everyday struggles of the residents of Newark, and then those people, often policymakers or activists, who came to the city at key turning points. And who saw what was unfolding in Newark as part of a national story. And often these two groups had shared goals. They both perceived Newark as a catalyst for new social movements or as a potential model for all kinds of reform. But they've also clashed over who is to lead these efforts and who's going to benefit from the changes in Newark. So in this context, following on Mark's lead here, it's perhaps appropriate to mention that I came to this project as an outsider to Newark with very thin family connections. My father grew up in Elizabeth, and he worked in the mailroom of Prudential Insurance to raise money to go to college. And then he met my mother when they were both social workers in East Orange in the 1960s, and they moved to upstate New York to my mother's hometown. So I grew up in a very rural area next door to my maternal grandmother's dairy farm. And most of my interactions with Newark prior to studying it were driving by on family visits to my paternal grandmother in Elizabeth, and my mother would sort of angrily wave at the boarded up high-rises of Newark as evidence of how the Reagan administration was letting the cities of the country kind of fall apart and what great cities these had once been. So, you know, as a child, I paid little attention to what my mother was saying about this, but obviously it was a seed in my head that I returned to about 15 years later when I was in graduate school and searching for a city and a topic to write about. I knew I was interested in what happened to North American cities in the late 20th century. Like Mark, I was very influenced by Thomas Segru's Origins of the Urban Crisis. And Newark, as I started to sift through the articles, newspaper, magazine articles, profiles of local activists, it was a city that seemed to provoke all kinds of superlatives. And one example, in 1975, some of you may have come across this, Harper's Magazine declared Newark the worst city in America, the worst city in America. So reading that, you know, for many outside observers, reading through the newspapers and the magazine accounts of the time, the 1960s had really closed the book on Newark as a viable city. That's the kind of impression that you get. But obviously the historical evidence I found as I started researching really complicates that chronicle of Newark as simply one of accelerating decline and civic dissolution. So in a way similar to Mark, I was asking about, as I began my project, what happened to the people who remained in cities such as Newark. These accounts were filled with stories of people leaving Newark, but what about all the people who stayed, people I guess like your parents, John, who moved here at the time, and to the civic culture that they created to sustain their neighborhoods. And what does their experience reveal about cities more broadly after the long, hot summers of the 1960s? And these questions, again, I felt were not sufficiently covered in the history that's out there at the time, partly because it's such recent history and still being kind of compiled and drawn together. And so I wanted to focus on the kind of lived experience of residents organizing to change their neighborhoods in the sort of shadow of the urban crisis. So I looked at the historical work on the urban crisis. I looked at the emerging scholarship on the Black Power movement and Black nationalism. There are a number of books that have come out in the last 15 years, including one by Kamosi Woodard, who's a historian at Sarah Lawrence College and has written Nation Within a Nation about Amir Baraka and the Black Power movement in Newark, and in fact kind of gave me some suggestions of people to get started talking to when I began this project. But as I read that, I felt like those books are just beginning to sort of look at the variety of beliefs and organizing strategies that fell under the wide category of black power in the 1960s and the kind of political alliances they enabled. And Newark, of course, provided a very useful case study for this sort of investigation because one of the country's sort of most vital black power movements took shape in the city. So in my dissertation, one of the arguments I make is that to understand the kind of successes and limitations of black power in the 1960s, what it accomplished, what it wasn't able to accomplish, we have to understand the kind of variety of its expressions and the degree to which black power developed not just in opposition to institutions, but also within them. And my ideas about this kind of developed in concert with a lot of the individuals I interviewed. I did a lot of oral history for my dissertation. And so I wanted to write a history that would account for the experience of someone like Joyce Smith Carter, who some of you may know, who's been a longtime activist in the city of Newark. And as a young woman in the 1960s, Carter was active in the Catholic Church, yet she was also active in the sort of emerging black nationalist movement in Newark that was very critical of the Catholic Church and other institutional other churches. And the convergence of this is captured in a story Carter recalled to me of walking across the Central Ward one morning to her job with a Catholic youth organization, and she heard this music drifting across the kind of streets that were still kind of run down, boarded up houses, and it turned out that some of the black nationalist groups had come together. They had erected a stage on a flatbed truck in the courtyard of a housing project, and the music of Sun Ra, who was a musician sort of loosely affiliated with the black arts movement that Baraka had helped create, was sort of serenading the residents of the Central Ward as they woke up that morning. And that moment to her, that was a convergence of two worlds that she kind of remembered very vividly 40 years later. And her story captured to me two elements that I think are significant and kind of missing from the history that exists. First, that she showed us how the years immediately following 1967 were marked by cultural and political ferment, that there was a sense of spontaneity and excitement that is often lost on outside observers, that as dire a situation as the city found itself in, there was also this moment, excitement about kind of rebuilding and remaking the city. And the second point is that Carter's political identity developed at the intersection of new black power organizations in the city and established organizations like the Catholic Church. So these two things are kind of coming together in her experience. And Newark has provided for me a lot of archival richness to explore these intersections. I needed the oral history interviews to help me map the overlapping civic networks of the city and to understand the experiences that I needed to sort of flesh out with visits to the archive. So I would interview one subject, one person would introduce me to another. Some people, including Bob Kurgan, opened up their personal papers for me to take a look at, their notes from organization core meetings from the early 60s. So all of these things helped to enrich the project. So a few years into it, I realized that I had started my research looking at journalists, like Time magazine articles, Harper's, things like that. People who kind of spoke, I would say, spoke not for the city, but of the city. And they tended to do it in very kind of, in a dismissive fashion. And some of these articles are rich and interesting, but a lot of them sort of fit its residence into radical or reactionary caricatures that I think kind of populated late 1960s kind of conventional wisdom, and I wanted to sort of move beyond that. So as I did that, I was kind of, able, I think, to dig a little further into the experiences of the people who were living in the city and trying to build it. And so some of the organizations and experiences I look at were the groups that fought for community control over the New Jersey College of Medicine and Dentistry. I looked at activists who were involved in the sort of stop and go, the slow integration of the region's construction trades, the people who founded Newark's first generation of community development corporations. And in the question and answer period, I can talk more about any of those examples. So as I found as you kind of delve into this local level, the issue of who speaks for the city is magnified. Conflicts between insiders and outsiders, as many of you know who are familiar with the city, was rife during the 2002 mayoral campaign of Cory Booker, for example, a more recent example. But those of you in this room who have a deep history, a deep knowledge of Newark, you know that the barbs traded in that campaign had a familiar ring, had a deep history. During the early 1960s, as the city's war on poverty got off the ground, similar charges were waged against Cyril deGrasse Tyson. Tyson was a protege of the prominent psychologist Kenneth Clark. Clark was at Columbia, helped mount the case for school integration in Brown versus the Board of Education, and Tyson had been a sort of student of his and had worked with him. So Tyson commuted across the river from New York to his job implementing community action through the United Community Corporation. And he oversaw the development of community action programs that were initially touted as national examples, as models that the rest of the country could follow as they started to put the war on poverty into action in their own cities. So understanding how Tyson approached his role as an anti-poverty warrior kind of required going outside of Newark, retracing his intellectual path and what he brought to that role. So I guess as I started looking closely at the experience, people's local experience on the streets and the organizations in Newark, I was then thrown back to consider the larger consequences of what was unfolding in the city. So this sent me not only to city archives here, the Newark Public Library, for example, but to state and federal archives in Newark and College Park, so I could better grasp the gap between the kind of goals of civil rights and anti-poverty legislation and the very frustrating reality of implementing this legislation on the ground. And this was a task that often depended on the persistence and the initiative of grassroots activists. So my research took me from the rich archives here in Newark, Trenton, and College Park. And as I recreated the social networks of Newark, I ended up trekking to archives in Indiana, to Wisconsin, and to Massachusetts, and sought documents from collections in California and Michigan, all of which, by the way, I wouldn't have been able to do without without the internet. I mean, really, the databases that are available today allow you to sort of access these a single folder that's tucked away in a the city clerk's basement in some town, so as I went through, as I traveled around then, I mean, it became clear to me that Newark's story, and I think there is a lot that is unique and singular about Newark, but Newark's story is a story of an American city. It's a story of American cities, and it will send you all over the country to tell that story. It will send you crisscrossing to archives, to churches, to universities, to people's basements and closets to pull that story together. And so I want to give two examples about how my research has led me to question sort of the bounds between local and national, between the insider and the outsider, and how we have to keep all of these things kind of in the air as we tell the history of Newark. I interviewed, for example, Gustav Henningberg, who some of you might know. I think I've seen him at some of these events in the past. And among the many things that he did in Newark, one of them was to help create the Black and Puerto Rican Construction Coalition and the Newark Construction Trades Corporation. And these organizations helped to train and place African American and Puerto Rican workers in the construction trades at a time when these were predominantly, sometimes some of them were exclusively white trade unions, and they were very resistant to integrating. And with their persistence, the integration of the region's construction trades was eventually codified in what was called the Newark Plan. Now, to give you some idea of how significant this was, starting as early as 1962 and possibly earlier, although this is the kind of earliest evidence I have for it, Newark activists had specifically pressured the federal government to investigate discrimination in the area's construction trades and to help kind of devise a plan for correcting it. And they did do investigations, but these investigations yielded few lasting improvements. They yielded sort of agreements that kind of disintegrated in the next few years. And in the late 1960s, they requested that the federal government select Newark for the implementation of the Philadelphia Plan. And the Philadelphia Plan, as the title suggests, is a kind of affirmative action plan for integrating apprenticeship programs in the construction trades. And it had come out of civil rights clashes in Philadelphia. And it was now being sort of promoted by the federal government to cities around the country. Now, Newark was initially, I believe, selected for implementation of the Philadelphia Plan, but then for some reason that I've not yet been able to quite determine, it fell off the list. So activists who were looking forward to some intervention that would help them achieve their goals saw this possibility kind of disappear. And so this led state and local activists to devise their own plan, which they did, the Newark Plan. And as this was getting off the ground a few years later, in 1970, then Secretary of Labor Hodgson finally announced that he would impose a federal plan on Newark to speed the integration of the trades. Now, at this point, Newark became the first city in the country to successfully reject a federal plan. And you may ask, after years of rallying and sort of in some ways begging the federal government, showing the federal government the evidence of discrimination, begging them to enforce their own laws, why would they reject this? Well, at this point, they realized that their own homegrown version, this hard-fought version, the Newark Plan, was actually superior to the federal version. It had already, they had laid the groundwork. They had collaboration, not always, sometimes reluctant, sometimes begrudging collaboration of the trade unions and the employers, but it was there. They had put this together. They had already shown impressive results compared to other cities. So I think understanding that's an important chapter not only in Newark's history and the labor history of Newark, but also understanding how affirmative action was implemented across the country. Understanding the push and pull between those who wanted it and those who opposed it, between the federal policy making on the one hand and on-the-ground experience of the people who were searching for jobs, the activists who were advocating for them. It's not complete without understanding Newark's story. And for political scientists, too, who are interested in this push and pull between local and federal, the problems of federalism, I think it's also an interesting example. The second example, and I know we're running a little late here, so I'll try to wrap it up. The second example, the final section of my dissertation explores the rise of community economic development organizations in Newark. And I focus on the New Community Corporation, among several other organizations, which got off the ground with the combined efforts of urban and suburban residents, with white and black volunteers, many of whom were affiliated with Queen of Angels Church. And I think historians are, in the work that's coming out right now in the 1960s, are beginning to understand the Catholic Church, like many other institutions, also experienced the political tumult of the 1960s in ways that kind of go beyond the changes of Vatican II. The Black Power movement, the women's liberation, the anti-poverty movement also made inroads into the church, and they unfolded not only in opposition to the church, but inside its very walls. People were engaged in the questions these movements raised. So I was, in the beginning of this project, researching Catholic civil rights activism in the archives of Notre Dame University. And I was looking for Newark examples. I was researching kind of generally what was going on, hoping to find some of these. And I happened to get into a conversation with another scholar there. And this scholar was researching Father Leo Mahone, who was a Chicago, actually I think he's still alive, a Chicago priest who had worked with the legendary community organizer Saul Alinsky in the 1950s. Alinsky's name came up recently in the recent presidential campaign when there were debates about President Obama's connection to community organizers and the Alinsky model of organizing, which was very controversial at the time. So Mahone and Alinsky had worked together in Chicago, organizing neighborhoods. Mahone later moved to Panama, where his San Miguelito mission became one of the laboratories of an emerging movement of liberation theology in Central America. And I had heard and read that there were some young priests working at Queen of Angels in the 1960s that had connections to Mahone, but I didn't know very much about it, and I just happened to mention it on a lunch break to the scholar. So 2 days later, he happens to pull out of a file he's looking at a letter, and it's a letter from Father Thomas Carey at Queen of Angels Church to Father Leo Mahone in San Miguelito, and they're discussing the trips they have planned. Carey's already sent some of his young priests to San Miguelito. They're trying to get Mahone to come up to meet them, I think, at a Holiday Inn near the airport, so they can have a meeting. They don't want anyone in the Archdiocese to know about this, though, so they're writing back and forth about whether or not they can pull this off. But more important than the logistics, the travel, is that they see, the Newark people see what's going on in Panama as very relevant to what's going on in Newark, right? They see aspects of liberation theology as something that can be imported and sort of applied to the Newark situation in the 1960s. Interestingly, they also say that while they are hoping to get a meeting with the women in the church, they really want to focus on the men, which I thought was kind of a sign of the times too. So if there's not time for the women, too bad. So they're in need of a little gender analysis there, I think. Anyway, that's so these are just two little a handful of letters that kind of opens up this whole world, these international connections. So I think these are two examples of telling Newark's history requires this constant adjusting of a lens between macro and micro, insider, outsider, the local and the national. And that's, I think, really the way to approach it, and it sounds like if you were going to characterize what new historians, young historians of the city are doing, it sounds like that's something we're all engaged with. And I've thought about this a lot as a fairly new PhD on the job market, which is it's not a very good job market, and employers always want to know why Newark. And implicit in this question, which by this point kind of annoys me after all these years of working on it, is, what applicability does Newark history have to what I'm interested in, or to other cities, or to our department, or why Newark? And this is a question that is both simple and very difficult for me to answer. It's difficult because it's so self-evident to me, having worked on it for many years now, and having an investment in telling the story of the city and the people who are in it. But it's simple because my research has revealed to me that Newark's history is very firmly entrenched in the story of the national Black Power movement and the story of American cities in the late 20th century. And it clearly illustrates this tug-of-war among cities, states, and the federal government over funding and control of the war on poverty. And it reveals to me that Newark residents were forging links with activists in Panama, for example, who saw that the struggles of the Central Ward in this Newark, is a compact, dense city, and here we have the Central Ward, and these activists see this in a global context. So I think, that there are many ways that you can answer this sort of question of why Newark, as you kind of go forth and tell the city's history. So thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to talk.
The floor is open to some questions, comments.
There's two questions that I have, are sort of the same. John, I don't remember it all that well. Number one, I was teaching, and I did read the newspapers quite assiduously. Did the Star Ledger discuss the Branch Brook Park outbreak?
Yeah.
How well?
I'm sorry. At the archives, one of the projects that Professor Jimenez and Wagenheim put together was to have her students go through the materials from the local newspapers and actually pull those materials out and create a press clipping, basically, for the entire event. But they absolutely covered it. The Times covered it. Newark News may have covered it. No, actually, I think they were still. Are they really? There was another Newark newspaper.
Newark News was not.
In any event, the Star Ledger, and I know, and the Times absolutely covered it. Yeah.
And Mark, just sort of a question. Did the Newark News discuss I think they did, if I remember, all the varying points of view that you were pointing out, like, for instance,
Just to start the answer with a broad generalization, I would say no.
Repeat the question for us here.
Oh, sure. The question was whether or not the newspapers had also captured this range of voices or versions or readings of the violence that I think are captured in the commission testimony. And as I said, just in a general sense, I would say no, in that they did not cover the range of voices, but you can, in other words, they didn't deliberately go out looking for sort of alternative versions, but if you go out and read, an article in the evening news from, say, the 5th day of the violence or something like that, it might have a quote from a police officer, and, you get an idea of what at least this individual thought about the riot, and you can compare that to, say, a riot commission. But whether the newspapers did not call attention to the fact that there were these disputes or debates, like the debates themselves were not a news story, is what I would say. But I think the information is available for you there if you look at the newspapers. Does that make sense?
Well, I'll point out that Craig was convicted in November, which is going through that conviction was thrown out. The Baraka family and John McCrae were innocent. Ray Brown was the attorney for the second trial.
And was commissioner on the governor's commission.
Yes. I've enjoyed this very much, being a insider and observer at Newark for a while. But I have a comment, I guess, more than a question. Kind of gave me the idea, Julie, because it was that some of the potential employers asked, why Newark? And you gave your reasons. 3 words I did not mention, which I think Newark is very much about, are race, poverty, and power. And as a case example of the dynamics of those 3 things in the American context, I don't think you can find a more powerful case. And I would just add that to your to your list, because and I guess in a way what's underneath this comment is also the point that I'm a political scientist, and I find it curious in a way that none of those words were mentioned in the course of the whole evening. And that much of what you guys are really talking about...
Well, Mark talked about power extensively.
Well, yeah, but okay, that's true. But what I hear most of all is issues of power, and the power of institutions in particular, and leadership, and individuals, and so on, and which all do make a very, very profound difference in a city like Newark, or in any city. I guess my other question was for you, John. I wanted to ask if you had interviewed Ken Gibson about 1974, because I did recently, and I think you would find his interpretation of events very interesting. Yeah.
Julie, do you want to comment on this?
I guess that's a little disturbing to me, because I feel like my project is a lot about that. It is about power and the contestation within institutions, to understand black power organizing, for example, not in a way, I think the early diagnosis of black power as a movement was that it was sort of only interested in separatism and opposition, sort of branching off from existing institutions, and there's elements of that. Obviously, it's a complicated movement, but what I see in my dissertation and looking in Newark is a way in which Black power is kind of unfolding within existing institutions in all kinds of varieties. I guess does that make sense? Which is why, in some ways, I'm looking at how Black power in Newark is kind of making Labor Department officials think differently about the way they're going to sort of implement affirmative action, how they're going to mediate between trade unions and activists on the local levels to basically carry out a mandate that a lot of them are very reluctant about. But I apologize for not making that clearer in the talk.
I was very interested by your talk and the fact that there is really no narrative of Hispanic history in Newark. But when you mentioned the different groups that you considered Hispanic, you didn't mention Portuguese. And the Portuguese certainly have played an enormous role. That was just a...
It's a very... This is a question over cocktails. It's governors, right? Right. It's a tough question because there's no doubt that if you go through the Ironbound, the impact of the Portuguese community, the Spanish community is enormous. I would go to Spanish clubs to go hang out with friends in high school. I mean, this is what we did. But I think that within U.S. Latino history, the Spanish experience, putting aside the explorers, the conquistadores, the oñates, the cabeza de vacas, that experience really isn't seen as part of the U.S. Latino narrative. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it may very well be that Newark is a place to look at the interaction between what are seen as the major post-1965 Latino immigrations to the United States, the Dominicans, the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans, and these older immigrations like the Spanish, who've been here since the 1920s. It may be that Newark is a place to look at the interaction between both of these groups. I just don't think that they're included in the narrative at all. And I'm not sure why.
I mean, the Portuguese Brazilian is not included.
I don't think the Portuguese is included. I think the Spanish is included. If you look at, just to give you an example, Harvest of Empire, for example, which is Juan Gonzalez's book on Latino history in the United States, there's really no mention of the Spanish outside of the conquistadors. I'm not sure, outside of, I think the only example that we have in U.S. Latino historiography is to look at the influence of Spanish cigar workers in places like Tampa, Ybor City, where they were really involved in anarcho-syndicalist movements. But outside of that, there's really just not a lot written about the history of the Spaniards or the Portuguese in the U.S. So I don't know why we don't do it. I don't have a good answer. I'm not defending it, but it's not part of the narrative as it's been constructed.
Kimberly DaCosta Holton at Rutgers in the Lusophone Studies program is working on a project dealing with the Portuguese and Brazilian communities in the Ironbound.
My question is for John. I think that all the presentations have talked in one way or another about these questions of race and poverty and power in Newark. And how does adding Latino history to that story in Newark complicate what we've heard from the other two papers tonight?
I think one of the things that you walk away from with the story of 1974, the riots of 1974, is that having blacks in a leadership position doesn't necessarily mean that problems go away for people of color. There is an enormous, I think, for example, there's some work done on the history of Los Angeles, where you see an enormous amount of tension between Mexican Americans and African Americans over political power on the LA City Council, for example. And I think Newark is an example of the contest between blacks and Latinos at a time when federal funding for cities or federal investment in cities is going down. I mean, this is a problem that's very current. I work in New York City. I happen to work for a firm that does political consulting and lobbying, and for the last 3 weeks, the New York State government has been shut down, and has been shut down by two Latino legislators who are they are special characters. I know them both. But their argument, and you almost wish that they didn't use it, but their argument carries some measure of validity, which is that there is very little political power exercised by Latinos in New York State, whereas the governor is African American in New York State, the chairman of the Democratic Conference is an African American, the majority leader is an African American, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is an African American. There's a question about the contestation of power, I think, between these two groups, and I think adding Latinos to the mix in Newark, it muddies the waters, but life is muddy. So.
Well, I think you might want to add to that Bill Gibson is African American, the police department, all right, without the other issues.
I absolutely, and that's
those are the guys that started the.
Right. And to his credit, I think that Gibson's reaction after the riots was really a reaction made in good faith to honor the complaints made by the Latino community. There was, for example, a Hispanic judge appointed to the municipal court in Newark. Many people don't know this, but the actor Raul Julia, who's the famous Puerto Rican actor, was actually a staff member of Gibson's and was his press officer dealing with the Puerto Rican community. And actually, many of his works are in the archives that Professor Jimenez de Wagenheim has put together at the Hispanic Information Project at the public library. So.
Yes, I just have one quick question for all of you. In all your research, did you ever come across a paper I did which then was published in Urban Affairs Quarterly? When I went to Rutgers in '68, I did a final paper called Newark's Black Leadership that was published in Urban Affairs Quarterly in '69. Dr. Marion Paley, who's a professor at University of Delaware now, was my professor, and I did it under her leadership. I remember interviewing Bob Kervin, Junius Williams, and others, but it was a study of Newark's black leadership. I think Ed's got it doing you. But we had two of us doing this as a project called Newark's Black Leadership, Urban Affairs Quarterly. Did you ever come across that? I'll get you.
Back on at least on the intersection of race and power, two questions. I guess they're for John. One is that in the run-up to the Gibson election, there was a Black and Puerto Rican coalition that, at least a nominal coalition, that was active then. So one question is do you see any links currently between the Latino population and the Black population in terms of common cause? And then secondly, within the Latino population, leaving aside for a moment the Iberians, right? If in the late 60s we could say Black and Puerto Rican, now you would probably say African American and Latino. But is the Latino community united, or would they see themselves more generally as South American, Ecuadorian, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban?
Well, let me try to answer the second question first, which is that I think that even in the 1970s, you had widely different opinions among Latinos about how to resolve the urban crisis, so to speak. There was a school of thought of moderate, fairly conservative Puerto Ricans in Newark, a lot of the members of the Hispanic Emergency Council, who really thought of themselves as advocating for inclusion within the U.S. system. I mean, this is the argument that Gonzalez makes about, for example, the GI Forum, which was a big organization among Mexican Americans after World War II that used the power of being a veteran to argue for inclusion of Mexican Americans within the American National Project. So you have that one school. And then you have many more radical elements. Here in Newark, we had the Young Lords. The members of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party were very active here in Newark as well. So you do have a much more radical element within the city, very much influenced by the Cuban Revolution. So you have those divergent opinions even back then. Today, obviously, it's very difficult to get a hold of what it means to be Latino in the United States. It's very different from being a Puerto Rican in the North Ward to being, a Dominican in Washington Heights. It's just there's so many different experiences. I think, however, that there are some issues where you can build common cause around it. There's a healthcare crisis for Latinos. More Latinos lack health insurance than any other group in the United States. Educational attainment rates for Latinos across the board are lower on average than they are for other groups. So those issues you begin to see as common cause. But at a national level, the Cubans have their own group, Cuban American National Council. Mexicans have their group, National Council of La Raza. The Puerto Ricans have the Puerto Rican National Forum. The Dominicans have the Dominican American National Roundtable.
Here's the question: is a Latino who's coalesced around a Latino candidate for mayor
here in Newark? Well, it would depend on who that candidate for mayor was. I happen to know one. I don't know if he's a candidate for mayor, but look, at the end of the day, politically in Newark, what's going to move a Latino candidate is going to be Puerto Rican voters. The fact that Puerto Ricans are born citizens, that they don't have to go through the immigration process in order to become eligible for the franchise, that makes it very, very big, a big deal. And in much the same way that in New York, they simply will drive the process here. There are fewer Puerto Ricans here than there have been in the past, but still, I'm sure that I haven't seen the last numbers from the clerk's office, but I'm sure they make up the lion's share of Latino voters. And there are 5 Cubans left, and I know them all. So.
Yes, we're going to add, Mark's going to add one thing, and then we always promise that we're out by 8, so we'll wrap up.
I just wanted to add to this discussion of sort of Black, Latino, Iberian, or Lusophonial political alliances. And one thing that we have to keep in mind, I think, and this has been in the back of my head, I'm trying to keep track of little mentions of this. One thing that we have to keep in mind is Portuguese colonization, colonies in Africa. And that I asked Kim Holton about this once, if she ever came across any instances of, say, Black activists in Newark, protesting, picketing, or whatever, the Portuguese consul or something like that. And she said that she was aware, and she was sort of fuzzy on the details but she believed it was Baraka had called for a boycott of like Portuguese wines or Portuguese restaurants or something like that.
In Gold, too, over in Gold.
Yeah, exactly. And then I recently, and I would have to dig up the citation, came across an actual example of some Black power activists picketing the Portuguese consul. And I think it was Angola, but so that must affect the alliances as well.
I just want to add my thanks to everybody here, Mark and John and Julia, for what I find a thrilling evening. For one who is trained as an historian and loves to roll up his sleeves and get into the archives. You did a very good job of following the questions that we posed to you about your sources. And I would just ask, there are people in this room who have sources. And just be aware how important your papers, your materials are. We have a couple recent examples. Nancy Zach, who was on our panel last time, has given George how many filing cabinets to the public library?
Okay, they're being delivered tomorrow.
They're being delivered. Well, we'll find out. I think it's 8 to 12, but cabinets from her experience over the last 40 years. There will be a proper announcement of this in due course with Stan Winters, who many of us know from NJIT's history department and a long-time participant in Newark efforts and historian, has given his archive of the Clinton Hill Neighborhood Coalition efforts in the 50s and 60s, which is an interracial, interreligious effort. Those materials have just been given to the public library. So keep this in mind, those of you who have your own materials and whose own experiences have been part of Newark history and the Newark experience. But again, thank you to each of you. I'm sure many of you will want to carry on conversation into